Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We are just waiting for folks to join in, and we'll be getting started in 2 minutes. All right, everyone. Well, welcome to today. We're really excited. It has been an interesting week, but we are really grateful for people taking time out of their busy schedules to join us for the Healthy Planning Leadership Series. This is when we cover what's new, what's next, and what matters. Today we're going to be working on healthy food systems, and we have a really amazing lineup of folks joining us. Just a couple of logistics before we get started. One, we are recording the session, so we actually record the session so that folks are able to come back and watch the lectures later on. The other thing is, because we have a large group, everyone is muted, but we do really encourage questions. So on the panel on the lower right-hand side, you can type in questions. We try to get through as many questions as possible with the different speakers. We encourage you to send those along as they come up, and we'll work those in as the presenters are talking. Just with webinars, sometimes there are technical issues. The number, if anything comes up, from GoToWebinar is 855-352-9002. And also you can send an email into us, and we have staff support here. So we've been covering a lot of topics. As I mentioned, this is the fourth one. We do a whole host of different issues around health and planning. Our next session is going to be a special session. We've been working with the Department of Education, and we're going to be doing a session on how planning and school districts can come together, so stay tuned for more information on that. There's been an amazing leadership group that's helped us plan all of this. I can't say everybody's names, but really this wouldn't be possible without their time and input. We had a really diverse group of planners and public health professionals to think about how to bring a series together. And also our sponsors. So we have sponsorship from the California chapter of the American Planning Association, as well as the Health Officers Association of California, so that we're able to offer credit. Just in full disclosure, none of the speakers or the Planning Leadership Committee have anything specific to disclose. And at the end of the survey today, and then also in the email that you'll get in follow-up tomorrow, we also have questions, a series of questions. We encourage that because we would love feedback, but specifically if you're applying for credit from either professional organization, it does need to be filled out, and it should be filled out by the 21st. For medical credit, we will send you the credit, and then for planning credit, you will actually be able to get that through your own login information with the APA. The other thing we've done, part of this work is really, I think, very powerful because it's working across sectors. It's working with people that we maybe don't always connect with. We have a LinkedIn group where we can share ideas. We can also share funding announcements or other webinars that are related. And so we'll send you an invitation in case you're interested in that. So today we're going to be talking about healthy food systems, and I think one of the challenges, I grabbed this picture from the web, it can be a bit nebulous and it can look a little bit overwhelming as to all the different places to intervene, and how do you really make something actionable. When I look at some of these diagrams, I start to think, well, where do we take action? What's the role for land use planning and health, and how do we really make an impact with all of this? I think, one of the big things around land use planning, we know that place matters, especially around food access. This is just a great screenshot from UC Davis with one of their GIS tools looking at different things around opportunity, but you can see the places in red are the lowest opportunity to access supermarkets, and the places in green have high access. So these are really important things to be thinking about to really make a tangible difference. Today we're going to actually start to learn about some of those things. We're going to think about how you can start to think about healthy food as a priority in a various range of different policy and planning issues across the board. We're going to hear from some speakers around access of braided funding and different ways to implement some of this healthy food system work. Also how communities have used data to prioritize in their own local communities. And that's something we're not getting into specifically today, but there is new legislation, SB 1000, that we're going to be providing more input on over the next year. We really want to, a lot of what this series also has done is making sure that we're sharing innovative programs. So we're going to hear from a local jurisdiction doing just that. And as with everything, we're really thinking about how planning and health can work together. So I have excellent speakers. Just a quick introduction. So we have Matt Ramey. He's the founder of Ramey & Associates. He has written extensively on planning and public health in sustainable neighborhoods. They do a lot of work across California, working on implementing health and equity into planning, and he's also a lecturer at UC Davis. We have Jessie Gook, who is with the California Department of Health. She's the lead program and policy specialist, nutrition, education, and obesity prevention branch. That is a mouthful. But she has done a ton of work across the food systems, has worked both on the ground and at the high-level policy level, and has run a number of programs. And Jessie also, in addition to all of her public health work, has a master's degree in urban planning with a focus on community health. Keith Berthold is the executive director of Fresno Metro Ministries, so they're doing really amazing work in Fresno, which we're going to hear about. And in addition to his work at Metro Ministries, he actually helped lead the update for the general plan guidelines that Fresno adopted for Fresno 2035. He's also been working in community organizing and has worked with a number of congregations on justice and equity in Fresno and beyond. And then Brenda Smith is with CalRecycle, so she is our special guest. We ended up, I met with Brenda. They're doing some really great work at CalRecycle, and there's some really interesting funding opportunities come up. So we were able to bring her in today, so she's going to share some of those. But Brenda has had a long history of state leadership. She's been working as a branch chief for the statewide technical and analytical resources, and works on a number of issues, including organics and climate change, and we know that a lot of that intersects here. So with no further ado, I'm actually going to hand it over to Matt to get us started. And Matt, I am making you a panelist.
Okay, thank you.
And there you go, perfect. Take it away.
All right, you all can see my screen, I hope? Great, so thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks to everyone for participating in this really important and interesting discussion. My role on this panel is essentially to use a food analogy to set the table for the webinar. I'm going to talk about really what is a healthy food system, and then some of the land use tools that are available to make this happen, land use and other tools. I want to start out just by very quickly saying about my company, Ramey & Associates. We've been around for 10 years, and our focus is really planning, urban design, and health, and we do all of this, we do all of our planning work with a health and equity lens. Sorry, my slide just moved forward. A health and equity lens. We look at climate change and sustainability, and we do research and applied evaluation to make sure that the work that we're doing is actually being implemented. I want to really start by trying to define what a healthy food system is. And you know, Elizabeth, I think your diagram was really interesting, and you also highlighted one of the aspects of a healthy food system that a lot of people think about, which is access to supermarkets. I think what I want to talk about today is that it's so much more than that. So a healthy food system is one that really ensures that all residents have access to healthy and affordable food options. So it really is about what people eat, and then also beyond that about what the environmental impact is of food production and transportation, how we actually essentially get food produced and then to the community, who has access to it, the economic benefits, the jobs that are created, as well as the conditions of the employees who are in this industry. And then I think it is really important to think about this as a system, and we need to think through not only how we get food into the system, but also how we get it out with collection and reuse of organics. There are commonly people think about 6 components of a local food system: production, processing, distribution, access, consumption, and then waste recovery. And I think this is a really good framework for really thinking about a food system, and we really need to think about it as a system. And I think when we're talking about land use planning and we're with planners and public health folks, we tend to, I think, focus on one aspect of it, of maybe the supermarkets or farmers markets or the ability to grow local food. But we need to think about this as a much larger system. It has to be thought of as where the food is produced and making sure that the land use regulations are in place, where we're growing food, how that food is processed and where it is processed, the distribution and how we get the food from the processing facilities and processing locations to the stores, how people access and who has access to the healthy food, because there's a big equity issue, what people eat, and then how we recover waste and put it back into the system. There are a lot of planning tools that we can use, and I won't spend much time here, but we really know what those tools are. General plan, policies and land use, zoning, ordinances for a variety of topics. There's community-based initiatives. There's programs and regulatory incentives. So there's a lot of different tools that we really know about, and the question is, how can we be creative and inventive with these tools and really apply them on a system-wide basis so that we can achieve this vision of a healthy food system. I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about what we've identified as 9 strategies for a healthy food system. The first is that with the production, on the production side of things, we need to think about the land use tools that can be used to preserve farmland. There are a lot of tools out there. These include things such as urban growth boundaries, conservation easements, pesticide buffers, incentives for organic practices, clustering of development to allow for farming, density transfer or transfer of development rights, and others. And there's a lot of work being done across California and all across the country to make it so that farming is viable for all scales of farming. There is a zoning and land use program in New Jersey to make agriculture friendly. It encourages agribusiness. It reduces the incidence of farmer and homeowner nuisance issues. It allows farms to support businesses and other uses, and this is really critical for smaller farms who might actually need to supplement their business with perhaps a bed and breakfast or sell produce. And then it also reduces regulatory barriers to auxiliary farm operations, including housing for farm labor. The second strategy is to support processing and distribution channels. I think in my experience that planners and public health folks really kind of get and we've been thinking about farmland preservation for quite a while. But I think that this idea of processing and distribution channels and the role that land use and planning can play in this is actually often overlooked and really an opportunity for exploration and for new ideas. So we really do need to figure out how we can support processing and distribution and overcome the barriers to these challenges. So some of the things that we've seen that are going on are incentives for shared regional processing infrastructure, facilities, and logistics, also called food hubs. Really allows smaller farmers to join together for processing and distribution of their products. There are, in more urban areas, there's zoning and incentives for commercial kitchens or small on-site agricultural processing. There are mobile USDA certified slaughterhouses, a big issue for livestock is actually USDA certified slaughterhouses, and there's very few of them, but there are strict regulations about this. So there's some interesting ideas about this as well, and also zoning districts for manufacturing, processing, and distribution of agricultural goods, especially in rural areas. One example of something that's happening is the Agriculture and Land-Based Training Association in Salinas. They have an organics food hub. There is a farmer education course. They have an organic farm incubator. They're doing a match for CalFresh participants, and they're doing environmental education with schools. So some really good work happening there. The third is to allow food to be grown in public spaces. And this tends to be some of what we think about in terms of urban agriculture, support for urban farms, support for community gardens, and allow for edible landscapes. So there's a lot of opportunity here. I think there's a lot of great work that's happening across the state and a lot of thinking that's being done with this. But support for urban farms, for example, vacant property tax incentives to allow for temporary urban farms, urban agricultural zoning. Of course, you have to deal with the sort of the urban, the agriculture-urban interface. For creating community gardens, there's community gardens, policies in general plan and zoning to support that, school gardens. And then for edible landscapes, allowing fruit trees in parks and on sidewalks. Baltimore has a really interesting plan called the Grow Local Plan, and they're looking at revised zoning regulations to allow farms and urban gardens and promoting the use of vacant city lots for green space. Moving on down, and I'll move through here quickly, but the next is to allow people to grow and raise their own food on private property. We've seen a lot of this happening, but there's things such as urban chicken and livestock ordinances, landscaping that allows people to grow food in their front and side yards. Believe it or not, it's prohibited in some places. The next is to provide access for healthy food. Again, we've done a lot of work in this area, but three main categories here of food retail, such as incentives for supermarkets, limits on things we don't want, farmers markets, identifying food deserts and alleviating that, removing regulatory barriers for new markets. Parking actually can be a big issue with this and a big land use challenge here. And then supplemental food programs such as farm-to-school procurement programs. Next is to create programs and incentives for healthy eating. Once you get the people, you can provide access, then you really want to do things that can actually encourage people to eat healthy. There's a lot of municipal nutrition standards that we see now, healthy and local food sold in public buildings, healthy snacks at public workshops and park concessions. We have contracts where we're required to provide healthy food at our meetings, and these are just a few examples of programs. Next is reducing food waste, and this is an area that, again, we need to tie into the system, and we're going to hear more about it later, but it includes things like prevention in terms of the amount of food, food recovery, if it's not being used, if the food is not being used, where it can go, so through food bank donations, and then recycling of food that of the food waste and putting that back into the food system. The eighth is to take care of people in the food industry. Again, this is not always tied in with healthy food systems, but we need to think about, especially with housing going up, we need to think about farm worker housing. We need to think about fair wages and working conditions and avoiding toxic exposure for the workers. Finally is building partnerships for healthy food systems. Two main points here to talk about. One is that there's a lot of jurisdictions that have been creating, or regions that have been creating food policy councils. So bringing folks together across a food system to figure out how that system can improve in terms of the delivery of food and minimizing the environmental impacts and promoting the economic benefits. The second is to think about health in all policies and take that approach and focus it on food. It's pretty amazing when there are so many at the regional, the local and regional level, and then at the state and federal level, how many entities and regulatory agencies are involved. And this diagram on the right just identifies a handful of them that might be involved in the food system. So it's really critical to bring folks together to make sure that they're all focused on the same outcome of a food system. They're all talking and not working at cross purposes. I have here, since this will be sent out later, I have a series of resources that you all can look at. Thank you. Just one more quick point. I think it's really encouraging. There are so many folks on the line, and I would really just encourage the continuation of this discussion, as well as thinking about healthy food as a system, from big picture of where it's grown all the way through to how it's distributed, sold, where people how people eat the food, where they access it, and then how that gets back into the food system. Thank you. Elizabeth, you want to take control?
Thank you. No, that was fantastic. I mean, as we are going to move over to have Jesse speak, I think one of the biggest challenges, one, I think there's a great opportunity, as you said, that there are so many people that are interested in this. We'll hear about some of the ways to get around the challenge, which is often funding, but what are some of the other things that what has made some of these local governments who are really embracing it? What has been some of the kind of secret sauce or magic to getting that to happen?
I'm not sure there is a secret sauce to getting it to happen. You know, I guess I've seen that the jurisdictions that are really connecting the dots and tying healthy food to equity issues, tying it to economic development, and really diving in and understanding, and at least from a land use perspective, what are the actual barriers that need to be overcome. And a lot of times the regulations that are in place for a really good reason, but they have unintended consequences. And so I think the places that are doing the best work are starting to end with another food analogy, to sort of peel back the layers of the onion and understand what are those barriers and why they're happening, and how we can begin to make these ties from the sort of the big regional where food is grown all the way down to how it gets to the stores and where people eat.
That's great. Well, on that, I'm actually going to hand it over to Jesse, and we will get started. But we will be, hopefully, some questions will be coming in, and we'll take those as we go. But Jesse, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Well, this is really great. I think Matt and Elizabeth have really done a nice job of framing this for me, and I don't have to talk a lot about the food system and its connectivity to other aspects of all of our work. Because the food system is so connected to so many other disciplines and systems, when we really talk about making impacts in the food system, we really are thinking about a comprehensive look at community change. And that lens can be any of these individual systems on the screen, like land use, or we can really take a long view and try and link work into a chain of strategic efforts that benefit all systems and the long-term health and prosperity of our citizens and communities. And we really have to think about funding in the same way. So when we talk about funding food systems work, and because it's multidisciplinary, it's really hard to pinpoint one place you can go to look for funding or to start or to sustain, really, your food systems work. More likely than not, it's going to require a diverse mix of funding to do comprehensive food system work. Today, we're really going to do our best to focus on funds that are directly related to land use, but it's not always that simple or straightforward. Many of the funds have a planning and implementation component to their funding streams, and while the implementation funds may fall outside of traditional land use activities, oftentimes the planning grants allow for the engagement of partners who may not otherwise come to the table and can help identify gaps to help determine an appropriate sustainable funding and action plan. And really this ties into what Matt just went over in his 9 areas for attention. I think we're going to touch on available funding or opportunities for funding in each of those 9 areas. So we're going to talk about quite a few different types of funding and try and give examples from multiple fields and potentially, if there's time, provide some case studies. And whenever possible, the slides include links to the actual funders and will identify active funds. And then we'll also look at some different funding models that go beyond traditional grants and short-term funds into more sustainable food systems work. So we're going to start with federal level grants. I'm not going to dig into a lot of detail due to time. The links are here for further investigation. I do want to note that even though some of these funds are listed in here throughout the presentation, some of them already go to local governmental jurisdictions. Others will need to be secured by partners. Again, it's all part of the comprehensive strategy to sustain and achieve that change. So the first one on the screen here, we have the community food projects. This is a really good one to have on your radar as it's aligned with multiple funding streams from the USDA. I'm going to use that as a case study, so we'll spend a little bit more time on it in a moment. For the second one down through the Department of Health and Human Services and the Administration for Children and Families, the Office of Community Services is going to award about close to $10 million in discretionary grant funds to CDCs for community-based efforts to improve the economic and physical health of people in areas designated as food deserts. So this is one of those things that might not look on its face a place that you would have gone looking for food funding, but this is going to be an incredible fund that, again, gets at what Matt was just talking about in terms of equity issues and what happens around funding food. This is a great program to take a look at. The next one, the AFRI Challenge area, focuses on the priority to mitigate and adapt climate variability and change. So again, something that Elizabeth referenced at the beginning and something that even though those of us on the phone may recognize, in terms of connecting with your partnerships, climate change and variability has an incredible impact on the food system. This supports activities that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase carbon sequestration in agricultural and forest production systems, and really prepares the nation's agriculture and forest to adapt to variable climates. Finally, the Water Smart funding. That fund is for projects that reclaim and reuse municipal, industrial, domestic, or agricultural wastewater and figure out ways to use it again, potentially in lots of different uses, including agricultural. So this is something that's a part of drought mitigation for the western United States, and again, not a place you might traditionally look for food funding. At the top of the screen here, we've got some EPA funds that support activities designed to empower and educate affected communities to understand environmental and public health issues and to identify ways to address these issues at the local level. So even though this environmental justice grant doesn't specifically call out food, it is very much embedded in that work. Again, we have another climate change fund that impacts the food system and how we utilize our natural and manufactured resources through the Fisheries Fund. And then finally, the Food Insecurity Nutrition Incentive Grant Program, or FINI for short, is another one that everyone should have on their radar, especially those of you in California. We'll talk a little bit more about the California-based fund when we get to state-level work. But while this is not directly related to funding land use, it's a complementary fund, and Matt alluded to this, to land use work that creates greater access to healthy food for farmers and farmers markets and retail stores by providing matching funds for food assistant recipients. So I wanted to take a moment to just kind of talk about the community food projects. Here we've got a fund that intends to accept applications to fund 2 types of grants. So again, we talked about this. We've got the community food projects, and then we also have planning projects. And the goals of the Community Food Projects program are to meet the food needs of low-income individuals through food distribution, community outreach, to assist in participation of federally assisted nutrition groups, and to improve access to food as a part of a comprehensive service. So there's a lot more information on this fund that will come when we share the slides. And this is another big fund, about $9 million. And I think we're going to hear Keith, our local example, talk a little bit more about this in his example coming forward. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on private funds here, both in terms of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation or Kaiser, but I really encourage you to check out their websites regularly, as they're big players in funding food systems and health work. For the America Walks Fund, I know it seems unlikely to list this in a food systems webinar, but really this is an example of linking funds for comprehensive community work. So you could think about perhaps linking this fund with other food access work to connect neighborhoods to retail centers, to schools with gardens, or schools with farmers markets. So it's about, again, that braided funding stream to really move towards a comprehensive, healthy community network. And we wanted to call attention to the APA funds, part of which I think funded this webinar series, not because this is an open fund right now, but because this Plan for Health Coalitions and the Plan for Health website through the APA is such an incredible resource for doing food systems work in connection to land use, that wanted to call it out there. Again, the Heal Cities campaign is something that Kaiser has been working on, and I know we have a primarily California audience. So for those of you that aren't familiar, and in case there are one of these coalitions in your community, we really encourage you to reach out to them to see what kind of work is already being done. At the state level, in terms of grant funding, mostly here we're taking a look at the California Department of Food and Agriculture. They're a great resource for food systems work. There's 3 funds here. First is to increase the competitiveness of California specialty crops. The second, I referenced this earlier, this is California's specific FINI fund to support the purchase of California-grown food by matching food benefit dollars. Again, those are those SNAP federal food assistance dollars, and this was something that came out of the California budget just this last year. So this is a new program and very exciting. And then finally, the Cal Ag Plate Grant Program funds go to promote agricultural education and leadership activities for students. And so this is really an incredible opportunity to access these funds to think about additional food systems work in your community. I've got a couple of California specific state grant funds that are private, so we'll let you explore those on your own. For local level grant projects, these are mostly resources similar to what Matt had at the end of his presentation, but I wanted to take a minute to talk about the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP Ed, which I have been referencing, and I'll get into that in just a moment. Take a look at your local foundations, your APA chapters, and then there is a link there for different local healthy food financing initiatives that provide some loans, microloans, and other financial assistance to actual retailers that can help with different sort of built environment changes around food access. So I did, like I said, want to take a minute to take a look at SNAP Ed. These aren't funds that you would necessarily apply for because they already go into the local jurisdictions in California. So in California, 60 of the 61 local health departments already receive SNAP Ed funding. And this is important because if we're referencing Matt's 9 areas, he talked about municipal systems and policy change. He talked about partnerships. There is already funding in your community meant to do this work, and they can support planners and other land use professionals in building out the evidence base that you need to really connect to some of these policy changes and make recommendations. And so I encourage you to reach out to your local health department and connect with the SNAP Ed program there to do land use work, because they have funds already in place to help support that from the health side, and they have plenty of data to back up that work. Another sort of best practice and example, and this is specifically called out as an example in terms of food access, but a braided funding mix. Again, it included funding from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection for energy reduction strategies like using energy efficient refrigerators and lighting. It also included the Department of Community and Economic Development that offered loans and other additional funding for facade and infrastructure improvements, as well as Department of Commerce. It had the local planning folks as well as the Department of Public Health. So it's a really interesting model to look at how they brought a mix of funding streams together to actually change the food environment in Philadelphia. We're going to switch gears a little bit here and move away from grants and really take a look at sustainable funding work that's going on around the country. And again, I'm going to fly through these, but we'll just take a quick glance at a couple of them. So in Minneapolis, they have a staple foods ordinance where they have required licensing to require a certain number of staple foods, and part of the licensing fee that they collect helps fund the program, so compliance and training for store owners in terms of actually having access to healthy food. So that's a really interesting model to look at. The next is around actually creating a position within your organization for food systems. Baltimore City has a food policy director. This is something that is coming up, and more communities are doing this, but it's still not the norm. Food doesn't fit into just one place, as we've talked about, so it is something that oftentimes also gets lost in the shuffle, because while everyone's looking at it, not enough people are looking at it specifically. So Baltimore did approve the funding for one full-time food policy director, and they are moving to move their food policy task force plan forward. So that's a really great example of what's going on there. The City of Berkeley, as well as some other folks here in California, just this past Tuesday have now passed different sugar-sweetened beverage taxes. What is happening here is these taxes are intended to support municipal health and nutrition programs, and so the tax comes in and they are actually able to reallocate those funds to different programs that improve health, and they have some discretion, and that could include land use components. So there are now a couple of models to look at, Berkeley having been around now the longest in California, but something to look at there in terms of generating funds to help sustain food systems work. Next, we have the Pea Patch Community Gardening Program in Seattle. So this is something that's actually run through general funds, and they do it through their Department of Neighborhoods, and they actually allow for, and Matt referenced this, the growing of food on publicly owned lands, and so looking at that as a model. And finally, we have two extra examples, which I don't think we have time for, so you can reference them when you get the slides. But again, the final one I think is really important, which is actually that the District of Columbia leases the land, so they actually get some money back to then support different work for city-owned property, which is another innovative example to think about how to fund these different food systems work.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Jesse. Well, and I think one of the key things, Keith, I'm actually going to be handing it over to you, but one of the things, I go to events all the time, and one of the first questions is, do you have funding? And we don't, per se give out funding through OPR on most things, but I just think it's great to see how many different resources there are, and I love the Philadelphia example of thinking about energy, because that really is, I think, key. So Keith, I'm going to go ahead now. We've heard about kind of the big picture framing of all these, how all of these things are interconnected, and how health departments and nonprofits and planners can really work together. Now, and we've heard about the funding, we were going to hear from Keith next on examples really on the ground of how to bring all of this together. So Keith, are you ready?
I'm ready. Can you hear me?
Hey, we can hear you. Great. We're going to mute ourselves and you're on.
Well, I am very grateful to be on this, and I'm thanking you for the framing, and Matt and Jesse, just really great stuff to understand these. We're just a little 46-year-old ministry that's been working in environmental, economic, and social justice and equity initiatives for a long time, and decided we really want to do more in food since we're in the heart of the Central Valley and major food production. And ironically, as you look at the CalEnviro screen, we're one of the poorest areas in California. And that's been driving us for a long time to really be more involved in practical solutions to a number of things. We have a Better Blackstone project in addition to our Food to Share project, and you can see that our rectangle in the place-based initiative we have is really got some serious problems compared to the rest of the state. This is a map that was included in the Fresno General Plan, which I worked on. As Elizabeth said, it shows Fresno in 1945, maybe 70,000 people, and then the red is the suburban expansion since the end of World War II, and that's resulted in the red on this map, over 40% concentrated poverty in the red areas, 20 to 40% poverty in the kind of yellowish areas, and then less than 20% poverty in the green. And these are sort of the values that drive us. How do we solve that? And it's kind of interesting that these areas on these maps also are kind of coincident with some major food deserts and lack of food access and things of that nature. So we got together with a lot of people, and we realized that we were the second most food insecure metropolitan area in the United States. Here in the middle of an area that grows almost 400 different kinds of crops within 100 miles around Fresno. So we've got lots of food. The problem was really, how does that food get from production and processing and logistics and outlets, to people who need that food. There's a group we work with called a Hunger Count, which did an actual survey. They talked to 64,000 people a couple of years ago, and they estimate that just in the Fresno-Clovis metropolitan area, there are literally 26,000 pounds of nutritious food missing from people's diets in our food deserts each year, 26 million pounds. So we kind of decided it's more of a logistical issue than anything initially, and that we wanted to figure out where's all the food going, and we realized that a lot of it's being wasted in Fresno, just like in other places in the United States, and we wanted to conquer that in some profound ways. And I just want to say that there's a lot of policy involved in this stuff. There's a lot of funding and all those kinds of things, but for our focus, the most important thing is relationships, and building new relationships around common values and shared goals and things like that is solving these kinds of problems. And this map begins to show some of those relationships, and I'll put in a plug for CalRecycle. They very much helped us in the beginning of our effort in late 2014, when they came out with an organics grant that really needed to include some sort of food recovery component. And we got a partner by the name of Culinary Energy Partners who was building an anaerobic food digester just about 40 minutes from downtown Fresno in Tulare County, and then put together a partnership, and it's called Food to Share. But the essence of it is, how do we collect food that otherwise would be wasted and probably buried and produce, deleterious methane gas, further compromising the poor air quality in the valley? How do we connect a lot of the people that are wasting food, so to speak, to people that need it? And so we kind of conceptualized this idea of a food network exchange, and we call it Food to Share. And it's really taking, building relationships with growers and packers, gleaners, farmers markets, food service facilities, all the people involved in producing food and distributing it, et cetera, with a lot of our different organizations. And we've been able, through this grant and some private money we've raised and working with some health grants and things like that, in this slide, you can't see it, but on our share side, we now have 80+ organizations that are actually feeding people, either redistributing food to disadvantaged community members in food desert areas in our metropolitan area, or actually providing meals. And then on the collect side, we've got over 40, nearing 50 organizations that actually are helping us get food that we're intercepting it that would have been buried or somehow thrown away. And we're starting to grow a very dramatic organizational opportunity here that we think is really going to grow in some remarkable ways. So lots of different partners and an emerging kind of network of folks. And we really started doing this work. We were building the capacity, building the infrastructure, the relationships, a technology-oriented website, which I'll bring up a little bit later. Over the last roughly year and a half, we really started collecting food this late spring and during this growing season. And we've been able to generate 200 volunteers. We're cooking at our food distributions and recoveries and showing people how to cook the foods that they get. We've done a number of school recoveries. We're only recovering right now from 3 schools. That will now grow over the next 6 months to 12 months to maybe between 20 and 40 schools. So we think the poundage from our school recoveries is going to be exceptional. We've done a few gleanings, very productive when we have volunteers. You can see the numbers there. Our direct food recoveries just this summer were nearly 20,000. And then we work with a lot of other organizations that give us food, and that's what we call recovered donated food distributions. We're moving up into the, we're well over 150,000 pounds this summer and moving into some pretty dramatic numbers, which we're very proud of because we kind of created this thing from scratch, so it's really a brand new kind of idea. Our distributions have been remarkable, and one of the things we do is do a lot of canvassing in the neighborhoods. We teach our churches and our community-based organizations that are distributing food how to do that canvassing to make sure people know about these distributions. We come in a farmer's market style, and on the way to the distributions, we are always showing them how to cook certain foods. We have recipe cards, really engaging them in that final piece of this is actually using new foods and different foods at these distributions and teaching them how to really appreciate, value them, and cook them and those kinds of things. Just in Central Unified, working at just a couple of schools over the summer, very limited effort, we were able to get 4,000 pounds. We're projecting that next year that could be lots of tons of food as we build those relationships with the individual schools and include them in our network. Gleaning requires a lot of volunteers, so we're building a volunteer corps, which is going very, very well. It's kind of a seasonal thing. A lot of this stuff, and Brenda can speak to this, a lot of people's backyards are full of productive fruit trees and other things, and a lot of times it falls off the trees, it gets put into the green container, and it goes to the landfill. So these are really productive gleanings. And then the cooking demonstrations that I mentioned, but just a lot of showing people how to use some of these foods and fruits in new ways that are really tasty. We make sure they taste them so they know what the opportunities are there. And then this idea of volunteers. We can't generate enough resources to do all the work that's necessary, and what we're tapping into is really a latent emotional, psychological, and even I'll call it spiritual need to be engaged, and we can do that very practically for people, and we're building this new volunteer corps, which is really, really kind of exciting for us. We've created a website, so we do direct recoveries. We have a truck. We only want to have one truck, and this new food exchange website at the Food to Share, just Google that. We have registered donors. We have registered recipient organizations. A donor can post a type of food donation. If it fits the profile of the recipient organization, they get a text and an email, and we're trying to get them to go directly to pick that up. We have this real opportunity, for a number of different ways to pick up food and do things, and a number of different organizations. And by the way, our website, if you go to it, we're profiling all the donors and we're profiling all the recipient organizations. In some cases, this is their first exposure to a broader public, so it's really serving a communication and marketing function for a lot of our member organizations. And that's really, we get a lot of calls. I wish I had time to tell you some of the stories about some of our big recoveries. And then what we've done is decided there's at a certain level, there's a finite pie. And what we're trying to do is expand the size of the pie. And so we decided we really wanted to create a thing called the Fresno Food Security Network. Metro has been designated as the backbone organization for this network. Our first meeting was in March. We had about 50 people from 35 organizations. That's now grown into an event we had in September where we brought 58 organizations that are involved in the food system and 73 leaders together. And we've now designed a way to build work groups, to do communications. We're doing broad-based events, and we think we're going to grow the capacity of our relationships through networks to overcome some of the boundaries that are implied by organizational identity and things of that nature. And so that's really a remarkable thing. And really to finish up, because I know we need to catch up a little bit of time, we are working very closely with the food bank, our local food bank, which covers 5 or 6 counties, Colony Energy, and our recycling partner, Caglia. And we're now in the process of designing a food waste prevention hub where we can have centralized intake for truckloads of food. Truckloads, I mean literally millions of pounds of food get taken to the landfill each year because we don't have a central place for them to go and have the bad food or stuff that's starting to spoil separated from the good food that can be immediately refrigerated and redistributed to in disadvantaged communities and those kinds of things. So now we're conceptualizing this new food waste prevention hub to really do this job. And I mean, literally, we've seen hundreds of trucks, and these are 40,000-pound vans that have to go to the dump because there's no logistical way to do that, no centralized function. So we're beginning to think of that. So I'll leave it at that. We're just very grateful for the opportunity to participate in this space. It's allowed us to pick a theme, food, which is a uniting kind of theme, to get literally hundreds, and we think eventually thousands of different people and organizations working to solve our food insecurity problem in Fresno County just by stopping wasting food and diverting that waste, that's net waste, to energy production or more productive uses. I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith. That was great. I think it's amazing just to see how much the communities come together, and there's so many partners. I think one of the things to do all of this really requires the policies in place. And since you worked on the general plan, I mean, I know there was the example that a local agency got funding, just as Jesse was mentioning, you're not supposed to grow food in certain places, and then the general plan policy didn't support that. So how are you guys working on the policy planning side to really support all of this work?
Well, we did a lot of advocacy around that, and of course I was in the city and helped to encourage a lot of advocacy around that, and we now have amazing development code which allows tremendous latitude for building community gardens without conditional use permits, a lot of by right activity, even urban farms. And to that effect, we've got a partnership with the Fresno Housing Authority. They've given us 10 acres, and we're building a 7-acre permaculture demonstration farm and a 2-acre community garden that's going to be led by residents of the Housing Authority site. Very low carbon footprint. They're walking out of their doors to the 10 acres right next to their facility. And this is all being done by right with a simple across-the-counter permit for us to build literally a 10-acre food production site on residentially zoned land in the city of Fresno.
Wow, that's amazing.
That would have taken us literally tens of thousands of dollars in time 2 years ago, and now it's a by right across-the-counter application.
Right. Well, and I think that's the key, is just like how important that policy, that big picture, you know, that Matt was talking about, that big picture framework of all of these different tools and levers to help accomplish that. Well, great. Well, and we have Brenda's slides up. Brenda, and so this is a great opportunity. We're going to actually get to hear, I think Keith mentioned a lot of how CalRecycle was really important to help get them off the ground with some of that funding again, and that nexus around climate change and land use and composting and how we think more systematically. So Brenda, I'm going to have you take it away.
That's great, and thank you so much for letting me be a part of this conversation. Yes, it doesn't always seem intuitive why CalRecycle might be in this discussion, because we oversee the waste stream that goes to the landfills, but there are 6 million tons of food waste sent to landfills every year in the state of California. And there are some state-level mandates and some funding that CalRecycle oversees that I wanted to bring into this healthy food system discussion. A recently passed state law, SB 1383, focuses on short-lived climate pollutants, of which methane is a very potent one. Methane is present at landfills and primarily to organics. This SB 1383 requires some things of CalRecycle, and I've listed those here in terms of reducing organics disposal, and highlighted in red a very important mandate within SB 1383 of 20% reduction in disposal of edible food waste by 2025. So CalRecycle has a heavy lift here in order to meet some of these statewide goals. We do have specific requirements, and we'll be developing regulations along those lines, and I've listed some of those requirements and dates affecting that rulemaking here, as well as we are required to report on progress to achieve these state mandates, and listed those requirements here as well. The last link on the slide here is connection to health impacts of short-lived climate pollutants that you might want to further check out. The funding that CalRecycle has received and is so excited to get out there connects with Keith's little glimpse into why CalRecycle is at the table, and that we did have earlier funding. We're in cycle 2. We received $40 million for this fiscal year 16-17, and we're already poised to move that money out the door quickly. 24 million of that 40 million is focused on building our organics infrastructure, which is building those organics waste processing facilities, half of those being digestion projects and the other half composting. But within the requirements for those projects is this partnership requirement that brings in a food rescue organization like Keith's into the mix. And so our applications for digestion or composting projects can come in the door and receive extra points if they have that food rescue partnership. Those particular projects are going to our public meeting next week for approval on the criteria, and we hope to be rolling out our funding notices for that $24 million in December. So we are moving quickly to get that money out the door. There's also some rural money set aside for that. We also have, within the $40 million, a brand new food waste prevention and rescue program that will receive $5 million. Very, very excited about that program in connection with Healthy Food Systems. We will be developing our scoring criteria and rolling that money out the door after the first of the year, so early 2017 you'll be hearing more information about that program. We recognize the need to work at the very top of the food waste hierarchy to rescue food before it becomes waste, to cut down on that 6 million tons of food going to landfills every year. So that program is going to be a very exciting connection to all of the interest on this webinar. We also connect with disadvantaged communities and conducted 2 workshops in October, one in the Fresno area, one here in Sacramento, to address the needs of those communities as they intersect with these funding programs. And again, our notices we hope to send out for the infrastructure program in December. I've also listed a couple of links here that you might want to check out for our Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund loans, as well as our Recycling Market Development Zone loans. We have $7 million available in each of those programs. And some additional funding sources that you might be interested in as well through the State Loan Guarantee Program or iBank, and also the California Capital Access Program. And there's an example there for the Hope of the Valley mission program. You might be able to check that out in their newsletter. And we at CalRecycle have a website that has much more information on food rescue and food banks, and I have also listed that as a possible link for you to check out. The other thing is how this connects to the waste stream and to climate change and greenhouse gases. And this slide shows a very important number that speaks a different language, and that is that for every ton of food that is rescued before it becomes waste and generates all this methane and greenhouse gases, you can avoid 2 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents. So that's a very large number. That's why greenhouse gas reduction funds are being used for food rescue, and that's why it's important for CalRecycle to be in the discussion to avoid that kind of methane being generated at landfills. This number is underpinned by the Air Resources Board work under their quantification methodology, and if you're interested in all kinds of researchy background information regarding the 2 tons per ton, you can check out those links on this slide as well. And then lastly, I just wanted to put up our CalRecycle contact if you're interested in following our work under the regulation development for SB 1383. You can contact Marshall Graham, and she can also connect you with our grant and loan program as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Brenda. That's fantastic. Well, I think one of the things that the number is really impressive. It sounds like one of the first steps for a lot of folks who are participating today will be to participate in the informal workshops that are going to be happening. Sounds like a good next step. I wanted to see if anyone had any specific questions. We had one question come in, and I'm going to open the line for Keith and Matt. But if anyone had any specific questions, one question that came in is, will we receive copies of the slides? And we are recording the webinar, but we will also, just because the speakers embedded so many great resources and links, we will be able to post those up on the website probably within the week to be able to do that. But I wanted to see if there were any specific questions from the audience. Otherwise, I have a couple questions, but see, I'm not seeing anything come in. Well, I guess one of my questions to all of you guys, and you're all unmuted, is, you know, for a local jurisdiction who's starting to think about, and there's just been this increasing interest, as we talked about, in how land use and planning and health can come together to address food systems. I mean, what do you think is a good, do you have a recommendation on a good first step, or how do you even get started when you have like 80 partners? What's the first step to start to do that? I see Jesse wanting to say something.
Well, I was just going to say that essentially the first place to start, I mean, one is if you have an established partnership, you know, doing a bit of a community assessment within that partnership to get a sense of where the low-hanging fruit is, to get yourself a couple of potentially quick and maybe easy wins to sort of everybody sort of wet their feet in terms of doing different food systems work, and also to generate a buzz around your effort and energy. And so I think for every community it looks really different. That's one of the things about California. Our capacity to do this work varies so greatly across the state in terms of funding and expertise and what you might do in an urban versus rural setting. So it's hard to have a sort of one-size-fits-all. But I think kind of coming up with a staggered tiered plan that gives you these long-term goals that's sort of fettered with quicker wins that help you keep momentum and move along and build partnerships and add to your base. I think that's a nice place to start generally.
Great. Matt and Keith and Brenda, do you guys have any other thoughts?
Yeah, this is Matt, and maybe I'll jump in. You know, I think it depends on really where the jurisdiction is starting from. But I've always found that it's you kind of have to do. I like this concept that Jesse mentioned of a community assessment. I think that community assessment can look at a variety of different things. You know, really one is understanding what is going on in the community, sort of from a food perspective in terms of the number of community gardens, how many people are using them, the number of supermarkets, the quality of food in those supermarkets. And so there's sort of some existing conditions and assessment that you can really do from the physical standpoint. A second is to understand who are the organizations in your community or around your community that are actually doing this type of work. So if you're really just starting and you're just getting into this, I think there is some assessment of resources within the community who could become partners in this. And then I think the third, from a land use perspective in particular, is actually to look at the general plan, the code and ordinances, and see, look at what some of the best practices are, and then see where your policies and regulations are relative to that. And there might be really some low-hanging fruit of, does our code allow people to grow food on their yard? And you know, what is our sort of the sort of urban agriculture and community garden example that Keith gave, which was wonderful. But you know, what are regulations getting in the way of what we're trying to achieve with this? So those are some steps that I think would be a good place to start as well.
And just to follow up, just make a note really quick. One, there's so many assessments out there that people can go pick up. You don't have to build your own assessment from scratch. You can find ready-made ones that you can then do within your community. And I would also add, connecting with your local health department, again, because from a health perspective, most of those, I won't say most, a lot of assessments have been done in regards to the food system, and they may have that data available for you to help you think about, from a land use perspective, what a next step could be.
Yeah, that's great. And I think just one on adding to processes that already happened. Keith, I'm going to speak for you. I know that as you guys did such an amazing job at outreach for your general plan update, that food became one of the top priorities identified by the community. It looks like we have one question, or a couple questions. One, the URL, so our website is www.opr.ca.gov, and that's where we'll post the videos. It looks like we also had another question for CalRecycle's upcoming organic grants. Can a food rescue organization apply for the Food Rescue Prevention Grant and be listed as a partner for an organics facility grant in the same cycle? So Brenda, that one's definitely for you.
A food rescue organization can be a partner under the infrastructure grants, which are opening soon, and then they can also come in later on with the new food rescue grants, which will be opening after the first of the year, as long as the activities, and win both of those grants, as long as the activities within each of those grants are distinct and separate. So we would not be double funding the same activities.
Okay. Great. I also, let's see, it says another kind of point came in, growing food along with conservation of water seems like an important issue with the drought. I fully agree, and I think that was why the example in Philadelphia that Jesse mentioned was so key. Let's see, are there a few organizations, let's see, Jesse mentioned several assessment tools that are out there. Can you list a few organizations and jurisdictions that have them?
Off the top of my head, no. I saw in Matt's slide that he had some connections to organizations like Change Labs, that Change Lab Solutions, that actually offer some of those tools on their website, but we can, I mean, I can send that in and we can be a part of it.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's part of, even with the LinkedIn group, which we will send an invitation to everyone who's been on this if they're interested. We list resources like that. And I know that the American Planning Association has a whole group, and there's some really excellent research papers that have been done on this nexus around land use planning and food systems and how to connect and come together. And then this one question, this will be our last question, this is for Keith. Have you considered farm gleaning?
You know, we have, but it's a capacity issue. So we're trying to master urban gleaning first, and frankly, you know, the urban gleaning is a little bit easier and more productive in terms of greenhouse gas reduction, because once we get out the farms, a lot of stuff just isn't, it wasn't going to be buried in a landfill. It's going to be dispatched into the soil on the farm. So we're kind of concentrating on maximum impact for greenhouse gas reduction initially, but part of it's just volunteers. There's been, you know, epochs in Fresno's history where there are lots of gleaners and then there's no gleaners, and we're trying to resurface a whole cadre of volunteers to do gleaning. So it's just capacity.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone so much. This has been just an excellent discussion and session with a ton of really actionable resources to take next steps. You guys give me hope. I think we can make a lot of progress in this space. So again, as I mentioned, stay tuned. Our next session is actually going to be on with the Department of Education, so a little bit different, but ways to think about new partnerships. And as always, we encourage everyone, this really comes down to your connections. So make connections, and yes, thank you, and look forward to the next one.
Thank you.